They put us here, thinking we were helpless old women with nothing left to give. But when you combine 6 supposedly powerless mothers and decades of suppressed anger, you get something no one saw coming. What we're planning will teach them that some mistakes can't be undone. My name is Lorraine Campbell, and until 6 months ago, I was a federal judge with 35 years on the bench. I had presided over some of the most complex cases in the Southern District of Georgia, handed down decisions that shaped legal precedent, and commanded respect in courtrooms where powerful attorneys trembled when I spoke. Now I live in room 247 at Sunset Manor Care Facility in Atlanta, where the biggest decision I'm supposed to make is whether I want pudding or Jell-O with my lunch. The transformation from Judge Campbell to Grammy Lorraine happened faster than I could have imagined, but the seeds were planted long before I recognized what was growing in my children's minds. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, with small changes in how Marcus and Keisha interacted with me after my husband Jerome's death 3 years ago. Jerome had been my anchor, my intellectual equal, and my partner in every decision that mattered. We had built our careers together, supported each other through the challenges of raising children while managing demanding professions, and maintained a household where respect and intelligent conversation were the foundation of our family culture. After Jerome's funeral, I noticed that my children began treating me differently, not immediately, not dramatically, but with subtle shifts in tone and assumption that accumulated like sediment in a river, eventually changing the entire landscape of our relationship. Marcus, who had always sought my advice on complex financial decisions, began explaining basic economic concepts to me, as if I had never managed money before. Keisha, who had built her own legal career partly by seeking my mentorship on difficult cases, started asking if I was keeping up with changes in the law, as if my 35 years of experience had somehow evaporated with my husband's death. The first real warning sign came during Thanksgiving dinner, 8 months after Jerome's passing. I was cooking the meal I had prepared for 23 years, following recipes I knew by heart, and managing the complex timing required to serve 8 courses to 14 family members. "Mom, are you sure you want to handle all this cooking?" Keisha asked, watching me baste the turkey with the same technique I had used since she was a child. "It's a lot of work for one person." "I've been cooking this meal for over 2 decades. I think I can manage." "I know, but things are different now. You don't have Dad to help with the heavy lifting." Jerome had never helped with the heavy lifting. He had been an excellent husband and father, but cooking had always been my domain, my creative outlet, and my contribution to family gatherings. His absence didn't change my ability to roast a turkey or coordinate multiple dishes. But Keisha's comment reflected a new narrative that was forming in my children's minds, that widowhood had somehow diminished my competence along with my companionship. "Maybe next year we should think about catering," Marcus suggested, "or having the dinner at a restaurant. It would be easier for everyone." Easier for them meant easier for them, eliminating the need to travel to my house and participate in the family traditions that had defined our holidays for decades. But it was presented as consideration for my supposed inability to handle tasks I had been managing successfully for most of their lives. I completed that Thanksgiving dinner flawlessly, as I had every year before. The turkey was perfectly moist, the sides were timed to finish simultaneously, and the desserts were met with the same appreciation they had always received. But throughout the meal, I noticed my children watching me with the kind of careful attention people pay to someone they're worried about. The scrutiny intensified over the following months. Phone calls that had once been casual conversations about work, politics, or family news became what felt like wellness checks. Marcus would ask detailed questions about my daily routine, whether I was eating regular meals, if I was keeping up with medical appointments. Keisha would inquire about my social activities, whether I was maintaining friendships, if I ever felt lonely or overwhelmed. "We just want to make sure you're okay," became their standard explanation when I questioned the increased surveillance. But I was okay. I was grieving the loss of my husband, certainly, but I was functioning perfectly well in all aspects of my life. I continued to serve on the boards of 3 charitable organizations. I maintained my involvement in the Atlanta Legal Society. I traveled to visit my sister in Charleston and my college roommate in Nashville. I read voraciously, gardened enthusiastically, and managed my financial affairs with the same careful attention I had always applied. The problem wasn't my competence. The problem was my children's discomfort with my independence. Jerome had served as a buffer between me and their concerns about my strong-willed nature. When I made decisions they disagreed with, they could express their concerns to him and trust that he would provide the tempering influence they thought I needed. With Jerome gone, they felt directly responsible for managing what they perceived as my impulsive tendencies and stubborn opinions. The truth was more complex. Jerome had never managed or controlled me. He had supported my decisions, offered perspective when I asked for it, and trusted my judgment even when he might have chosen differently. His presence had given our children the illusion that I was being supervised, when in reality, I had always been the primary decision maker in most areas of our lives. Without that illusion of supervision, Marcus and Keisha began to feel anxious about my autonomy. The anxiety manifested in increasingly frequent suggestions about changes I should make to ensure my safety and security. They thought I should consider moving to a smaller house in a retirement community. They believed I should simplify my financial portfolio to reduce the complexity of managing multiple investments. They recommended that I resign from board positions that required travel or evening meetings. Each suggestion was presented as loving concern for my well-being, but the cumulative effect was to restrict my activities and reduce my independence to levels they found comfortable. The breaking point came during a family dinner in February, when I announced that I had been invited to serve on a federal judicial selection committee that would require monthly travel to Washington, D.C. "Mom, do you really think that's a good idea?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the patronizing tone that had become increasingly common in our conversations. "Why wouldn't it be a good idea?" "Well, the travel would be tiring, and the responsibility might be stressful, and you're at an age where you should be thinking about slowing down rather than taking on new commitments." I was 71 years old, in excellent health, and had more relevant experience for the committee than most people who would ever be considered for such a position. The invitation was an honor that recognized my expertise and judgment. But my son was concerned that accepting it might be too demanding for someone my age. "Marcus, I spent 35 years making decisions that affected people's lives and liberty. I think I can handle evaluating judicial candidates." "It's not about your qualifications, Mom. It's about whether you need the stress at this stage of your life." "What if I want the stress? What if I find the work fulfilling rather than burdensome?" "Mom, sometimes we have to accept that what we want isn't the same as what's good for us." That sentence crystallized everything that had been building for months. My adult children had decided that they were better qualified than I was to determine what was good for me. They had appointed themselves as the arbiters of my capabilities and the guardians of my best interests. The committee position became a test case for the broader question of my autonomy. When I accepted the appointment despite their objections, Marcus and Keisha began what I can only describe as an anti-Semitism campaign to prove that their concerns about my judgment were justified. They started documenting what they called incidents that suggested I was becoming impulsive or unreliable. When I forgot to return a phone call immediately, it was noted as a memory issue. When I chose to drive to Charleston rather than fly, it was recorded as poor judgment about safety. When I disagreed with their investment advisor's recommendations, it was cited as evidence of financial irresponsibility. The incidents were normal variations in behavior and preference that every autonomous adult experiences. But they were cataloged and interpreted as symptoms of decline by children who had already concluded that I needed more supervision than I was willing to accept. The Judicial Committee work was demanding and rewarding, exactly as I had expected. I traveled to Washington monthly for 3-day meetings where we reviewed candidate files, conducted interviews, and deliberated about recommendations. The work required the same analytical skills, attention to detail, and judgment that I had used throughout my judicial career. But each trip became an opportunity for Marcus and Keisha to express renewed concerns about my ability to handle the demands of travel and the stress of important decisions. "Mom, you seemed tired when you got back from Washington last week," Keisha would observe. Of course I was tired. I had been working for 3 days. Fatigue after exertion is normal. But the kind of tired you were seemed different, more confused, less sharp than usual. I wasn't confused or less sharp. I was tired in the way that anyone is tired after intensive intellectual work and travel. But my children were interpreting normal fatigue as evidence of cognitive decline. The pattern continued for months. Normal human experiences, forgetting where I put my reading glasses, choosing a restaurant they didn't prefer, expressing political opinions that differed from theirs, were reframed as symptoms of impaired judgment or declining competence. The Judicial Committee work concluded successfully after 8 months. My colleagues praised my contributions, and the committee's recommendations were accepted by the appointing authority. I had performed at the highest level in a demanding role, proving to myself and others that my capabilities remained intact. But Marcus and Keisha focused on what they saw as the cost of that performance. They claimed that the stress had been too much for me, that I had seemed more forgetful and less organized during the months I was serving on the committee. "We're glad you got to do something you enjoyed," Keisha said after the committee's work was complete. "But we think it's time for you to focus on activities that are less demanding." Less demanding meant less meaningful, less challenging, and less connected to the professional identity I had built over 4 decades. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Tuesday in March. Marcus and Keisha arrived at my house with expressions of determined concern and a folder full of brochures for retirement communities and assisted living facilities. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation," Marcus began, settling into my living room with the gravity of someone about to deliver a serious diagnosis. "What about my living situation?" "This house is too big for one person. The maintenance is becoming a burden, and we're concerned about your safety living alone." I had lived in the house for 23 years. It was a modest 4-bedroom colonial in a safe neighborhood with excellent public services and helpful neighbors. The maintenance was minimal and easily manageable. I had never experienced any safety issues beyond the normal concerns that affect any homeowner. I'm not having problems maintaining the house or living safely, I said. But what if something happened? What if you fell or had a medical emergency? What if you forgot to lock the doors or turn off the stove? What if a meteor hit the Earth? Are we making life decisions based on hypothetical disasters? Mom, these aren't hypothetical disasters. They're real risks that increase as we get older. They're risks that affect everyone, regardless of age. Younger people fall, have medical emergencies, and occasionally forget to lock doors. Do you live your lives in constant fear of these possibilities? That's different. We're not 71 years old. Being 71 doesn't make me incompetent or fragile. No one is saying you're incompetent. We're saying that it's time to be realistic about age-related changes and plan accordingly. The brochures they presented featured the same smiling elderly people engaged in supervised activities that I had seen in marketing materials for retirement communities across the country. Sunset Manor Care Facility promised comprehensive care in a family atmosphere with activities designed to promote social engagement and mental stimulation. What the brochures didn't emphasize was that moving to Sunset Manor would require selling my house, liquidating many of my investments, and surrendering control of my financial affairs to family members who would manage my assets for my protection. I had overseen enough guardianship proceedings to recognize the financial motivations that often drove adult children's concerns about their parents' living arrangements. Moving elderly parents to institutional care preserved inheritance assets while giving children immediate control over financial decisions. Have you calculated the cost of this move? I asked, reviewing the pricing information in the brochures. The important thing isn't the cost, Keisha replied. The important thing is your safety and well-being. The cost is $4,500 per month plus additional fees for specialized services. That's $54,000 per year, not including the loss of equity from selling my house. Mom, you can afford it. That's not the issue. The issue is whether spending $54,000 per year for supervision I don't need is a wise use of resources that I might need for actual healthcare costs in the future. That's exactly the kind of complex financial planning that becomes difficult as we get older, Marcus said. That's why it makes sense to have professional management of your assets. Professional management by whom? The question hung in the air, though we all knew the answer. Marcus worked as a financial advisor and had been suggesting for months that I should consolidate my investments with his firm so he could provide more comprehensive oversight. Are you proposing to manage my finances? I'm proposing that we work together to create a financial structure that ensures your security without requiring you to make complex decisions about investments and asset management. And who would make those complex decisions? People who specialize in financial planning for older adults. People like you? People like me, yes. But the important thing is creating a system that protects your assets and provides for your care. I spent the next 2 weeks researching Sunset Manor and similar facilities, reviewing their programs, their financial structures, and their policies regarding resident autonomy. I also spent considerable time thinking about my children's motivations and the pressures that might be driving their sudden urgency about changing my living arrangements. Marcus had recently expanded his financial planning practice and was seeking to grow his client base. Managing my portfolio would represent a significant addition to his assets under management and generate substantial annual fees. Keisha had been struggling with the costs of private school tuition for her 2 children and had mentioned several times that she and her husband were feeling financially pressured by their current expenses and their need to save for college costs. Both of my children were successful professionals who lived comfortable lives, but neither had achieved the level of financial security that would make inheritance irrelevant to their long-term planning. If I lived independently for another 15 or 20 years, my assets might be substantially reduced by normal living expenses and potential health care costs. Moving me to institutional care immediately would preserve the inheritance while generating immediate income for Marcus through financial management fees. The conversation was a careful balancing of legitimate concerns with financial motivations that my children probably didn't fully acknowledge to themselves. When I pointed out that I was in excellent health, financially secure, and perfectly capable of living independently, they responded with the kind of patience that adults show to children who don't understand complex realities. "Mom, you're not thinking about this realistically," Keisha said. "You're focused on how you feel right now instead of planning for future needs." "What future needs?" "The needs that come with aging. Physical decline, cognitive changes, increased vulnerability to accidents and health emergencies." "Are you planning your lives around the assumption that you'll experience physical decline and cognitive changes? We're planning our lives around realistic assessments of aging-related risks." "Based on what evidence do you believe that I'm at higher risk for these problems than any other healthy 71-year-old? "Based on the fact that you're 71 years old." The circular logic was maddening. I was at risk because I was old, and being old meant I was at risk regardless of my actual health status or functional capacity. The move to Sunset Manor was presented as inevitable rather than optional. Not a question of whether I would move, but when and how the transition would be managed. I realized that I was facing a choice between accepting their conclusion about my declining competence or risking a confrontation that might permanently damage our relationship. I chose the confrontation. "I am not moving to Sunset Manor," I said during our next family meeting. "I am not selling my house, transferring control of my finances, or accepting supervision I don't need and don't want." "Mom, you're not being reasonable." "I'm being autonomous. There's a difference." "Sometimes autonomy isn't the most important consideration." "For whom?" "For people who are at risk of making decisions that could harm their long-term interests." "Are you saying that I'm not competent to make decisions about my own life?" They exchanged a look that I recognized from my years presiding over custody disputes. It was the look that parents shared when they realized that they needed to say something that would hurt their child, but that they believed was necessary. "We're saying that we think you need help making decisions that are this important," Marcus said carefully. "And if I refuse that help?"
"Then we'll have to consider other options to ensure your safety and security." Other options. The phrase that implied guardianship proceedings, competency evaluations, and legal interventions that would transfer decision-making authority from me to them. It was the threat that had been implicit in our conversations for months, finally made explicit. I had two choices: accept their management of my life voluntarily, or risk having control taken from me through legal proceedings that would be expensive, public, and potentially successful. After 35 years of seeing how guardianship proceedings worked, I knew that adult children who presented a united front of concern often prevailed over elderly parents who insisted on their continued competence. Judges were reluctant to leave vulnerable elderly people at risk, even when the primary risk was the displeasure of well-meaning family members. I made a strategic decision that would prove to be the beginning of everything that followed. I agreed to visit Sunset Manor. The visit was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, presented as an opportunity for me to see the facility and ask questions about their programs and services. Marcus and Keisha accompanied me, pointing out features they thought I would appreciate and asking staff members questions designed to demonstrate their informed concern about my needs.
Sunset Manor was an attractive facility with well-maintained grounds, comfortable common areas, and private apartments that were designed to feel home-like while meeting institutional safety requirements. The staff was professional and kind, treating me with the careful courtesy that people show when they're being paid to provide care, rather than offering it from genuine affection. But what struck me most powerfully during the visit was meeting the other residents. I was introduced to several women who had careers and life experiences similar to mine. Professional women who had managed complex responsibilities successfully for decades before being moved to institutional care by families who had decided that independent living was no longer appropriate. Carmen Rodriguez had been the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Emory University Hospital before her 3 sons convinced her that her Buckhead apartment was too demanding for someone her age. She had moved to Sunset Manor 8 months earlier, while her sons managed her financial affairs and looked for more suitable housing that had somehow never materialized. The hardest part, Carmen told me during a brief conversation in the facility's library, is that they mean well. They really believe they're protecting me from risks I can't see. But they've never asked what I think about those risks or whether I prefer autonomy to security. Estelle Chen had built and sold 3 successful technology companies before her daughter convinced her that managing her investment portfolio was becoming too stressful for someone approaching 70. She had moved to Sunset Manor so she could focus on enjoying retirement, while her family handled the burden of her wealth. I'd built companies from nothing, Estelle said, with the dry humor of someone who had learned not to take corporate presentations at face value. I negotiated complex acquisitions and managed boards of directors, but apparently I can't be trusted to decide how to spend my own money. The conversations were brief and carefully observed by staff members, but they were long enough for me to understand that Sunset Manor housed several women whose families had made calculations similar to those my children were making. On the drive home, Marcus and Keisha asked for my impressions of the facility. "It seems very nice," I said honestly. "The staff appears competent and caring." "And what did you think of the other residents? Did they seem happy?" "They seemed resigned."
Resigned to what? To having their families make decisions about their lives. Mom, that's not fair. Their families are trying to ensure their safety and well-being. Are they trying to ensure their autonomy and dignity? Sometimes safety and well-being are more important than autonomy. According to whom? The conversation continued in circles, with my children presenting Sunset Manor as a solution to problems I didn't have, and me questioning whether those problems were real or imagined. But during that conversation, I made another strategic decision. If I was going to be forced to move to Sunset Manor, I would use the experience to understand how families manipulated elderly relatives into surrendering their autonomy, and I would document the process for the benefit of other people facing similar situations. 3 weeks later, I moved to Sunset Manor.
The transition was orchestrated with military precision. Professional organizers sorted through my belongings, separating what would fit in a single room from what would be sold, donated, or stored. My furniture was replaced with institutional pieces designed for safety rather than personal preference.
My extensive library was reduced to a small selection that would fit on a single bookshelf. Marcus handled the financial arrangements, establishing accounts that covered my monthly fees while transferring control of my investment portfolio to his management firm. Keisha coordinated the physical aspects of the move, supervising the packing and ensuring that my new living space included familiar items that would help me feel at home. Everything was done with loving efficiency and careful attention to my comfort, but it was done according to decisions that had been made without my meaningful input. I arrived at Sunset Manor on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 suitcases, a box of photographs, and a growing determination to understand and document the process by which competent, elderly people are systematically stripped of their autonomy by well-meaning families. My apartment was on the second floor, with a window overlooking the courtyard where residents gathered for supervised outdoor activities. The space was comfortable and pleasant, furnished with institutional pieces that met safety requirements while attempting to maintain a home-like atmosphere. The daily schedule was posted on my door. Breakfast at 7:30, medications at 9, recreational activities at 10:30, lunch at 12, rest time at 1:30, afternoon programming at 3, dinner at 5:30, evening activities at 7, lights out at 9. For the first time in my adult life, my schedule was determined by other people's assessment of appropriate activities for someone my age. But I wasn't simply a passive recipient of institutional care. I was a federal judge with 35 years of experience evaluating evidence and building legal cases. If my family had forced me into this situation, I would use my time here to gather information that might help other families avoid similar mistakes. I began by observing and documenting the daily routines, the staff interactions, and the experiences of other residents. I kept detailed notes about how institutional life affected people's autonomy, dignity, and sense of purpose. More importantly, I began developing relationships with other residents who had professional backgrounds and life experiences that suggested they had been capable of continued independent living when their families decided otherwise. The first meaningful conversation happened during my second week when I was sitting in the recreation room pretending to be interested in a craft activity that involved gluing dried beans to cardboard. Carmen Rodriguez was at the next table, similarly engaged in artwork designed for people with limited cognitive capacity. "You know," Carmen said quietly, "before I moved here, I never realized how much power I had surrendered simply by being cooperative with my family's concerns." I looked up from my bean art project. "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 74 years, I made my own decisions about everything that mattered: where to live, how to spend my money, what risks to take, what challenges to accept. Then I allowed my sons to convince me that making those decisions had somehow become dangerous." She paused, considering her words carefully. "But the truth is, I'm the same person I was 2 years ago. I have the same intelligence, the same experience, the same right to determine my own life. The only thing that changed is that I let other people take control." That conversation began a series of discussions with other residents who had been professionals, business owners, and community leaders before their families decided that institutional care was in their best interests. Each woman's story followed a similar pattern: successful careers spanning decades, financial independence achieved through careful planning and hard work, years of managing complex responsibilities and making important decisions, then adult children who gradually became concerned about their mother's ability to cope with the demands of independent living.
The problem, Estelle observed during one of our evening conversations in the library, is that they never actually asked us what we wanted. They decided what was best for us and presented it as the only reasonable option. They infantilized us, Patricia Williams added. Patricia had been one of Atlanta's most prominent architects before her family convinced her that managing her professional responsibilities was becoming too stressful for someone in her 70s. And we allowed them to do it, Rose O'Brien said, with the blunt honesty that had made her a successful real estate developer. We went along with their conclusions because we wanted to believe they were motivated by love rather than convenience. Rose had developed several major commercial properties in downtown Atlanta before her son convinced her that the stress of property management was affecting her health. He had taken over her business operations and moved her to Sunset Manor so she could finally relax and enjoy retirement. The fifth member of our informal group was Amara Okafor, who had served as president of Clark Atlanta University for 12 years before her children convinced her that academic administration was too demanding for someone approaching 70. They had encouraged her early retirement and helped her transition to Sunset Manor, where she could focus on personal fulfillment rather than professional obligations.
5 women, 5 distinguished careers, 5 lifetimes of achievement, reduced to the same institutional routine of supervised activities and managed schedules. But as we spent more time together, sharing our stories and our growing anger at how we had been systematically marginalized, we began to understand that our individual powerlessness was partly an illusion. Separately, we might be helpless elderly residents dependent on our family's goodwill and institutional care. But together, we represented resources, connections, and expertise that our families had not considered when they moved us to Sunset Manor. Carmen maintained relationships with medical professionals throughout Atlanta who respected her clinical judgment and valued her mentorship. Estelle had ongoing connections with technology entrepreneurs and investors who sought her strategic advice. Patricia continued to receive royalties from her architectural designs and maintained professional relationships with developers and city planning officials. Rose owned properties and business interests that generated substantial income. Amara had connections in academic, political, and nonprofit communities that spanned decades of public service. "What are you thinking?" I asked Amara after she made an observation about our collective resources during one of our evening discussions. "I'm thinking that maybe it's time our families learned that treating their mothers like incompetent burdens carries consequences they never anticipated."
The idea grew over several weeks of careful discussion and planning. We began sharing detailed information about our financial situations, our professional connections, and our family's specific dependencies on our resources and relationships. Carmen's sons had built their medical practices partly on referrals and endorsements their mother had provided over the years. Patients trusted them because they trusted her, and colleagues respected them because she had vouched for their competence. Estelle's daughter had used her mother's technology industry connections to secure venture capital funding for her startup company. Investors had been influenced by Estelle's implied endorsement and her willingness to serve as an informal advisor. Patricia's family continued to benefit from licensing agreements for her architectural designs, collecting royalties from buildings and developments that bore her creative signature.
Her professional reputation also provided credibility for family members who worked in related fields. Rose's son had taken over her real estate business and was using her established relationships with contractors, investors, and city officials to expand operations. His success depended heavily on the network of professional relationships she had developed over decades. Amara's children had built their own careers partly on connections and recommendations she had provided. Her reputation in academic and political circles had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed.
In every case, our families have benefited substantially from our professional achievements, while simultaneously arguing that we were no longer competent to manage the careers and relationships we had built. They want our resources, but not our autonomy, I summarized during one of our planning sessions. They want the benefits of our life's work without acknowledging our continued competence. So we withdraw the resources, Carmen said simply. And we assert our autonomy, Estelle added. The plan that emerged was both elegant and devastating. We would systematically review and potentially modify the support, endorsements, and resources that our families had taken for granted while living comfortable lives based on our professional achievements. Carmen would contact her medical colleagues to reconsider referrals and endorsements she had provided for her sons. Estelle would reach out to venture capital contacts to discuss concerns about her daughter's company. Patricia would review licensing agreements for her architectural designs. Rose would examine the business arrangements her son had been managing. Amar would reassess her professional recommendations and endorsements. I would coordinate our efforts and provide legal guidance to ensure that our actions were properly documented and legally sound.
The beauty of this approach, I explained to the group, is that we're not doing anything unethical or illegal. We're simply exercising our rights as independent adults to make decisions about our own professional relationships and resources. And if our families object, Patricia asked, then they'll have to acknowledge that we're competent adults capable of making our own decisions, which contradicts their entire justification for treating us like incompetent children. The implementation began carefully and strategically. Each woman started making phone calls and sending emails to professional contacts, ostensibly to reconnect and catch up on industry developments, but actually to plant seeds that would grow into larger changes. Carmen began by calling former colleagues at Emory Hospital, expressing interest in resuming a more active role in medical education and mentorship. During these conversations, she mentioned that she was reassessing some of her previous professional recommendations and endorsements. I want to make sure I'm being responsible about the guidance I've provided over the years. I think it's important to periodically review whether my endorsements still reflect my current assessment of people's qualifications. The medical community in Atlanta is relatively small, and word traveled quickly that Dr. Rodriguez was reconsidering some of her professional recommendations. Within 2 weeks, Carmen's eldest son, Miguel, called to ask if everything was all right.
I'm hearing from colleagues that you're questioning some of your previous recommendations, he said during a tense phone conversation. Are you having concerns about specific people or situations? I'm having concerns about whether I've been as careful as I should have been in evaluating the competence and character of people I've endorsed, Carmen replied calmly. Are you talking about me and Roberto? I'm talking about everyone I've recommended over the years. I think it's appropriate to periodically reassess whether those recommendations were sound. Mom, this is affecting our practices. People are asking questions about our qualifications. Are your qualifications dependent on my recommendations, or do they stand on their own merits? The conversation ended with Miguel promising to visit Sunset Manor to discuss the situation. But Carmen had already achieved her primary objective,
Her sons were learning that their professional success was more dependent on their mother's endorsement than they had realized.
Estelle's approach was more direct. She contacted the venture capital firm that had invested in her daughter's technology startup and requested a meeting to discuss her ongoing involvement with the company. "I've been serving as an informal advisor," she explained to the senior partner during a video conference call. "But I'm reconsidering the level of my engagement and endorsement. Is there a specific problem with the company or its management? I have concerns about the long-term strategic direction and the management team's ability to execute their business plan," Estelle said carefully. "I'm not sure my continued involvement is appropriate given these concerns." The venture capital firm had invested partly based on Estelle's reputation and her willingness to provide strategic guidance. Learning that she was withdrawing her support created immediate concerns about the company's prospects. Within a week, Estelle's daughter, Jennifer, was calling frantically, demanding to know why her mother was undermining her business. "I'm not undermining anything. I'm making an honest assessment of business prospects based on my professional judgment. But you're destroying my credibility with investors." "I'm expressing my professional opinion about your company's management and strategy. If that damages your credibility, perhaps the problem isn't my opinion." Patricia's strategy involved a comprehensive review of the intellectual property licensing agreements that governed the use of her architectural designs. As the original creator, she retained significant rights that she had never fully exercised. She contacted the law firm that managed her intellectual property and requested a detailed analysis of all existing licensing arrangements. "I want to understand exactly what rights I've granted and what rights I've retained," she told her attorney. "I'm considering making modifications to better reflect my current interests and preferences." The legal review revealed that Patricia had considerable authority to modify licensing terms, adjust royalty arrangements, and even terminate agreements that were not serving her interests. When her family learned about the intellectual property review, they immediately understood the potential financial implications. The royalties from Patricia's designs provided substantial income that would be jeopardized if she decided to modify the licensing arrangements. "Mom, we've been managing these agreements for your benefit," her son protested during an emergency phone call. "You don't need to worry about the complex legal and financial details."
"Why do I want to worry about them?" Patricia replied. "What if I prefer to be involved in decisions about my own intellectual property?" Rosa's approach was the most dramatic. She retained a property management firm to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of her real estate holdings and the management decisions that had been made on her behalf. "I want an independent assessment of how my properties are being managed and whether I'm receiving fair value for my investments," she told the consulting firm. The evaluation revealed that while her son had been competently managing the properties, he had also been making decisions about renovations, lease terms, and development opportunities without consulting with Rose about her preferences or priorities. "I appreciate the work that's been done," Rose told her son during a difficult conversation, "but I've decided I want to be more actively involved in decisions about my own investments." "Mom, you don't need to worry about these operational details. Everything is running smoothly." "What if I prefer to be worried about operational details rather than excluded from decisions about my own property?" Amara's strategy involved a systematic review of her professional endorsements and recommendations. Over 12 years as university president, she had provided countless references, introductions, and endorsements that had advanced many careers.
She began contacting people she had helped over the years, explaining that she was reassessing her professional relationships and might be making changes to her ongoing endorsements. "I want to be more selective about the professional associations I maintain," she told former colleagues and contacts. I think it's important to ensure that my recommendations continue to reflect my current assessment of people's qualifications and character. Word quickly spread through academic and political circles that President Okafor was reviewing her professional endorsements. When her children learned about this development, they understood immediately that their own career advancement had been significantly dependent on their mother's reputation and connections. "Mom, people are asking whether you're having problems with your memory or judgment?" Amara's daughter Denise called to inquire. "They're concerned about why you're suddenly questioning relationships you've maintained for years." "My memory and judgment are perfectly fine," Amara replied calmly. "I'm simply being more deliberate about the professional associations I maintain and the people I choose to endorse." "But this is affecting our careers. People who have worked with us because of their respect for you are now questioning whether that respect is still warranted."
Are their relationships with you based on your own qualifications, or are they dependent on my endorsement? It's not that simple, Mom. Professional relationships are built on networks and recommendations. You're disrupting networks that took years to develop. I built those networks. I think I have the right to make decisions about how they're maintained and used. Throughout this process, I served as the legal coordinator for our group, ensuring that all our actions were properly documented and legally sound. I also began my own campaign to review the financial arrangements that had been made on my behalf when I moved to Sunset Manor. I contacted an independent financial advisory firm and requested a comprehensive evaluation of how my investment portfolio was being managed since the transition to Marcus's oversight. I want to understand the investment strategy, fee structure, and performance of my accounts, I explained to the senior advisor. I also want to know what options I have for modifying these arrangements if they don't align with my preferences. The analysis revealed that while my investments were performing reasonably well, the management fees were higher than industry standards, and the investment strategy was more conservative than I preferred, given my risk tolerance and time horizon. When I shared these findings with Marcus during our next monthly phone call, his response was predictably defensive. "Mom, we chose the strategy specifically because it's appropriate for someone your age. Capital preservation is more important than growth when you're in your 70s. According to whom? According to every financial planning expert who specializes in retirement portfolios. What if I disagree with their assessment of my priorities? Mom, you're not thinking about this objectively. You're too emotionally attached to investment decisions that should be made based on professional analysis. Are you saying I'm not competent to have opinions about my own money? I'm saying that financial planning is complex and you shouldn't have to worry about the details. What if I want to worry about the details?" By the end of our second month of coordinated action, all of our families were experiencing significant consequences from our systematic withdrawal of support and resources. Carmen's sons were dealing with questions from medical colleagues about their professional competence and integrity. Estelle's daughter was facing investor concerns about her company's management and long-term viability. Patricia's family was confronting potential reductions in income from architectural licensing agreements. Rose's son was navigating challenges to his authority over property management decisions. Amara's children were discovering that their professional networks were more fragile than they had assumed. And Marcus was learning that his financial advisory practice's newest major client had strong opinions about investment strategy and fee structures. But the most significant result was that all of our families were forced to confront a fundamental contradiction in their treatment of us. They couldn't simultaneously argue that we were incompetent to manage our own affairs while depending on our competence to maintain their professional success and financial security. The emergency family meeting was inevitable.
It took place on a Saturday afternoon in Sunset Manor's family conference room, with all 6 families gathering to address what they saw as a crisis requiring immediate intervention. The conference room was designed for difficult conversations about end-of-life planning and care decisions, but it had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. 6 elderly women sat on one side of a long table, facing their adult children, who had arrived with expressions of concern, confusion, and barely controlled anger. Marcus spoke first, apparently having been designated as the spokesperson for the group. "We're all here because we're worried about changes in your behavior that seem to be affecting your judgment and decision-making," he began, his voice carrying the gravity of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "What changes?" I asked. "You're making decisions that are disrupting professional relationships, creating financial uncertainty, and causing problems for your families," Keisha added. "Are you saying that making decisions about our own professional relationships and financial affairs indicates impaired judgment?" "We're saying that you're not considering the full consequences of your actions," Carmen's son Miguel replied. "You're creating problems that affect more people than just yourselves." "What problems?" Carmen asked. "Professional problems, financial problems, relationship problems that could have long-term consequences for everyone involved." Rose leaned forward in her chair. "Are you suggesting that we should make decisions based on your convenience rather than our own preferences?" "We're suggesting that you should consider how your decisions affect the people who love you and depend on you," Rose's son responded. "Depend on us for what?" Estelle asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. None of the adult children wanted to acknowledge explicitly that their own success and security were significantly dependent on their mother's resources and professional reputations. "Depend on you for stability," Patricia's son finally answered. "Depend on you to maintain the relationships and arrangements that benefit everyone." "Benefit everyone or benefit you?" Patricia replied. Amara's daughter Denise tried a different approach. "Look, we understand that you might feel like you don't have enough control over your lives here at Sunset Manor, but the solution isn't to disrupt everything else. The solution is to work with us to address your concerns about your living situation." "What if our concerns about our living situation include the fact that we were moved here against our preferences?" Amara asked. "You weren't moved here against your preferences. You agreed to come here." "Did we agree, or did we accept ultimatums?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with our children trying various approaches to convince us that our recent actions were inappropriate and potentially harmful. They appealed to our love for them, our concern for family harmony, and our supposed responsibility to consider the broader implications of our decisions. But they carefully avoided acknowledging the central issue, that they had systematically diminished our autonomy while simultaneously depending on our competence and resources. Finally, Estelle asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Do you believe that we are mentally competent to make decisions about our own lives?" "Of course we believe you're competent," Marcus replied quickly. "Then why are you living in our houses, managing our money, making decisions about our care, and benefiting from our professional relationships without our meaningful input?" "Because we're trying to help you manage responsibilities that have become burdensome." "Who decided that those responsibilities were burdensome?" "You did. All of you expressed concerns about the stress and complexity of managing your affairs independently." "When did we express those concerns?" The question revealed the fundamental dishonesty in their narrative. None of us had actually expressed concerns about our ability to manage our affairs. Our families had interpreted our normal requests for support and our willingness to accept help as evidence that we needed to surrender control. You may not have said it directly, Keisha admitted, but your actions suggested that you were becoming overwhelmed. What actions? Asking for help with certain tasks, seeming tired after demanding activities, expressing uncertainty about complex decisions. Are those not normal human experiences that every adult encounters occasionally? They are, but they're different when you're in your 70s.
Different how? These suggest that it might be time to accept more support and take on fewer responsibilities. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking Sunset Manor's courtyard, where several residents were participating in a supervised outdoor activity. They looked peaceful and safe, but they also looked diminished in a way that I had been fighting against since my arrival. "Here's what I think has happened," I said, turning back to face the group. "I think you've convinced yourselves that moving us to institutional care was in our best interest rather than in your convenience. I think you've persuaded yourselves that managing our affairs is protecting us rather than controlling us. I think you've decided that our attempts to maintain autonomy are problems to be solved rather than rights to be respected." "That's not true," several voices protested simultaneously. "Then prove it," Carmen said. "Give us back control of our own lives and see whether we manage them competently." "It's not that simple," Miguel replied. "You can't just reverse complex arrangements that were made for good reasons."
"What complex arrangements?" Rose asked. "Selling our houses? Taking over our businesses? Moving us to institutional care? Those arrangements can absolutely be reversed if we choose to reverse them." "But what about your safety? What about your security? What about ensuring that you receive proper care as you continue to age?" "What about our autonomy?" Amara responded. "What about our dignity? What about our right to make our own decisions about our own lives?" The meeting ended without resolution, but it had served an important purpose. Our families now understood that we were not going to accept their management of our lives without resistance, and that our resistance would have consequences they couldn't ignore. Over the following weeks, each family dealt with the crisis differently, but the pattern was similar. Our children were forced to choose between acknowledging our continued competence or losing the benefits of our professional achievements and financial resources. Carmen's sons eventually apologized for their assumptions about her declining capacity and invited her to return to her own apartment in Buckhead. They agreed to provide support services that she requested rather than care that was imposed on her, and she resumed an active role in medical education and mentorship. Estelle's daughter acknowledged that her mother's business judgment remained sound and invited her to serve as chief strategic advisor to her technology company. Estelle moved to a luxury apartment complex that provided services she wanted while maintaining her independence and financial autonomy. Patricia's family renegotiated the intellectual property licensing agreements to give her more control over her designs and a larger share of the royalties. She moved to a downtown loft where she could be close to the architecture community and continue her involvement in urban planning projects. Rose's son proposed a partnership arrangement that acknowledged her continued ownership of the real estate properties while providing professional management services that she directed, rather than services that replaced her decision-making. Amara's children apologized for underestimating her continued capabilities and helped her transition to a university town where she could maintain her involvement in academic and political communities while living independently. For me, the resolution was both simpler and more complex than the others. Marcus and Keisha acknowledged that they had misinterpreted my willingness to cooperate with their suggestions as evidence that I needed more supervision than I actually required. They offered to help me transition back to independent living with whatever support services I preferred.
But I had learned something important during my months at Sunset Manor. I had learned that my sense of worth and identity didn't depend on my children's approval or their recognition of my competence. I had learned that I could be perfectly fulfilled living according to my own preferences rather than trying to meet their expectations.
I had also discovered that there were other women like me who had been systematically marginalized by families who confused love with control and protection with supervision. So, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I chose to remain at Sunset Manor, but on completely different terms. I negotiated an arrangement that gave me a larger, more private apartment within the facility, while maintaining complete independence and autonomy. I established a legal practice specializing in elder rights and guardianship issues, serving clients who were facing the same challenges I had experienced. The practice operated out of Sunset Manor's business center, and I frequently represented elderly people who were dealing with families that wanted to take control of their lives for their own supposed benefit. My experience as both a federal judge and a Sunset Manor resident gave me unique insights into the legal and emotional aspects of these conflicts. Carmen, Estelle, Patricia, Rose, and Amara all chose to return to independent living, but we maintained our friendships and continued to meet regularly. We also established a foundation that provides legal and financial resources to elderly people who are at risk of having their autonomy undermined by well-meaning families.
The foundation is funded by contributions from all 6 of us, women who learned that our individual powerlessness was an illusion created by people who had convinced us that independence was dangerous and autonomy was selfish. We discovered that when supposedly powerless mothers combine their resources, their connections, and their decades of experience, they become a force that no one anticipated. Our children learned that treating your mother like an incompetent burden carries consequences that extend far beyond family relationships. They learned that respect isn't optional, that autonomy isn't negotiable, and that love without respect is just another form of control. But perhaps most importantly, we learned that it's never too late to reclaim your power, to assert your worth, and to demand the dignity that you've always deserved. The foundation now serves hundreds of elderly people each year, providing legal representation, financial planning assistance, and advocacy services to people whose families are trying to take control of their lives. We also offer education programs for adult children who want to provide genuine support for their aging parents without undermining their autonomy. 6 months after our coordinated campaign began, Marcus visited me at my new office in Sunset Manor. He looked uncomfortable and somewhat humbled as he settled into the chair across from my desk.
Mom, I owe you an apology, he began. For what specifically? For treating you like you were incompetent when you were just being cooperative. For assuming that your willingness to consider our suggestions meant that you needed us to make decisions for you. And for taking advantage of your generosity and your professional reputation while simultaneously arguing that you couldn't be trusted to manage your own affairs. It was a comprehensive apology that acknowledged the fundamental contradictions in how my family had treated me. Do you understand why I chose to fight back? I asked. I understand that you were defending your right to make your own decisions about your own life. Do you understand why I chose to remain here at Sunset Manor?
He was quiet for a moment, thinking about the question. I think you're proving that competent people can choose institutional living without surrendering their autonomy. And you're helping other people avoid the mistakes our family made. Exactly.
The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. Marcus began referring clients to my practice when they needed legal advice about elder rights and guardianship issues. Keisha started volunteering with the foundation, using her legal skills to help elderly people protect themselves from financial exploitation. They had learned that respecting my autonomy didn't diminish their ability to have a meaningful relationship with me. In fact, it enhanced our relationship by eliminating the resentment and resistance that had developed when they tried to control my life. 2 years after moving to Sunset Manor, I received an unexpected honor. The Georgia Bar Association presented me with a Lifetime Achievement Award for my work in elder rights advocacy. The ceremony was held in the same courthouse where I had served as a federal judge for 35 years.
Carmen, Estelle, Patricia, Rose, and Amara attended the ceremony, along with Marcus, Keisha, and dozens of clients whose lives had been changed by our foundation's work. In my acceptance speech, I talked about the importance of recognizing that aging doesn't automatically diminish competence, that needing support doesn't require surrendering autonomy, and that love should enhance dignity rather than undermine it. The greatest danger facing elderly people today, I said, isn't physical decline or cognitive impairment. It's the assumption that needing help means accepting control, that aging means accepting diminishment, and that love justifies undermining the very autonomy that makes life worth living. After the ceremony, a young lawyer approached me with a question that captured the essence of everything we had accomplished. "Judge Campbell," she said, "how did you find the courage to fight back when your own family was trying to control your life?" "I didn't find courage," I replied. "I found anger, and I learned that anger can be a tool for justice when it's directed at injustice, even when that injustice is committed by people who claim to love you." The foundation continues to grow, serving elderly people throughout the Southeast who are dealing with families that confuse protection with control. We've helped hundreds of people maintain their autonomy while receiving the support they need and want. But perhaps our greatest achievement is proving that elderly people don't have to accept powerlessness as the price of aging. We've shown that experience and wisdom are tools that become more powerful with time, not less effective. The women they thought were helpless turned out to be the ones who changed the entire conversation about aging, autonomy, and family relationships. We taught our children and the broader community that underestimating elderly people is not just cruel, it's dangerous for everyone involved. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt like your family was making decisions about your life without considering your preferences? How would you handle a situation where people who claimed to love you were systematically undermining your autonomy? Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is to exceed every expectation while holding people accountable for their assumptions.